Entonces dejo con ustedes a Kathleen, que va a hacer su presentación en inglés.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Yo hablo muy poquito en español, and I'm now going into English. But I do appreciate the invitation and thank you all for coming. My talk today is about innovation strategies, and let me get to the next slide. What I'm going to do is talk, really take two lenses, as the slide suggests. One of them is the university lens on innovation strategies, and the other is taking a look from the venture point of view, or the new firm point of view. Also, if I get talking too quickly in English, do wave to me or something and tell me that I'm going too fast for you. I sometimes get going quickly, so I'll try to stay slow. Anyway, what I'm going to do is talk really about the two lenses, the university lens and the venture lens. First of all, let's start out with the university lens and begin with maybe a historical point of view. In the US, at least, the federal government has been enormously important in the commercialization of university technology into commercial application. In a way that I think, despite perhaps our reputation as being a capitalist, free market, and so on, the government has been huge. In particular, the government initially supported the defense industry. The semiconductor industry, for example, is to a large extent driven by investment by the government, and later on the internet. So whether it's Department of Defense or it's the ARPA, basic research arm of the government has been very important in terms of funding research. It's also been very important in funding new products, and it's been very important in procurement policies. Procurement policies meaning purchasing. So the government not only funded basic research, but for example in semiconductors, made it easy for university researchers to begin companies and then have their products bought by the government. And in fact, in the case of semiconductors, the government actually paid a substantial premium over what they might have otherwise had to pay. So that became the way in which startups in the semiconductor industry were able to make a lot of money, which then funded some of the other things that they were doing. Later on, the government has also been very important in funding the medical industry, particularly the biotechnology industry. So overall, at least in the US, I think there's a strong story for the government being extraordinarily important in the commercialization of university technology. Another way in which the government has been highly influential is what is a legislative act called the Bayh-Dole Act. And this legislation, or this law, gave universities the ownership of the intellectual property from government-funded research. So prior to the Bayh-Dole Act, if a university researcher engaged in some sort of research and had a patent, the government owned the patent. After the Bayh-Dole Act, the university owned the patent. So now when a Stanford researcher, for example, does some research, has a patent, that patent goes to Stanford, not to whoever funded the research, or at least not in the government case. That had this law had a tremendous impact in terms of the number of patents that started coming out of universities, and subsequently the number of university-related ventures that were built on those patents. Interestingly, the first university entrepreneurs in the States from universities were mostly the elite scholars. So it was actually the elite scholars from the elite universities who were the first to take advantage of the Bayh-Dole Act. And finally, kind of an interesting sort of side note is that although the Bayh-Dole Act increased the number of patents, in fact, it didn't really help the overall quality very much. I'm not quite sure. I think the reason for that is, what most people say is the reason is that also it got a lot of people patenting who maybe didn't actually have particularly wonderful inventions. But so one saw it increasing the number, if not the quality. The implications of what I've been saying so far is that the role of government has, at least in the US, been extremely important. Legally, for funding, and for procurement, in the conversion of university technologies to commercial innovation. But while the strong government story is true, the story at Stanford is, I think, a somewhat richer story, and in some sense, a more successful story. Stanford is probably the most successful US university in terms of transferring university technology into commercial ventures. Those of us from Stanford Engineering like to think of Silicon Valley as Stanford Engineering. Much of Silicon Valley that you know about, whether it's Twitter, it's Facebook, it's Google, or in some of the older companies, are coming out of, many of them are come out of Stanford Engineering. And so what I want to do is talk about the Stanford story, but instead of talking about what you might expect me to talk about, which is computer science and electrical engineering and so forth, I'm actually going to talk about the music department. Because what's sort of a little known fact is that the music department, patents out of the music department have been the second most important for the university in terms of royalty streams. So while many people don't think of the music department as being a place where you might have technical innovation, in fact at Stanford has been an extraordinarily important department for that. So let me just now segue into a little bit of a story about the Stanford Music Department. The Stanford Music Department began actually much later than most other music departments within the US. It is a department that at the time the story begins is not a particularly renowned or famous department, either at Stanford or among university music departments throughout the country. The story also begins not with a faculty member, but begins with a graduate student. And so that's also a little bit of a different feature, I think, from what many people think. In particular, the graduate student's name was John Chowning, and he arrived as a PhD student, and he came with the idea that the computer can be a musical instrument. And so that was sort of his idea. He'd read some popular magazine articles, and he'd come up with this idea that, well, you could really somehow you could turn a computer into a musical instrument, and you could be able to compose interesting music by using the computer. Consistent with a particular feature of the Stanford culture, he was given free rein by his advisors to do what he wanted to do. And that's, I think, the first point I want to make, is that the Stanford culture is one in which students, PhD students, can pursue a variety of interests of their own as long as they can find at least one faculty member who's willing to be their advisor. So there's a lot of flexibility with regard to what students can do. And so while most people thought his ideas were a little bit on the crazy side, particularly people in the music department thought it was kind of crazy, his advisor was going with him. In fact, and perhaps there's certainly some degree of luck here, I'm sure, John had a major technical breakthrough, and that was in FM synthesis. And I don't think you want to know the technical details of FM synthesis, but it's essentially about how you can use the computer, how you use computers and various kinds of mathematical techniques to create a synthetic FM modulation. And to give you an example of how important this innovation is, most popular recording artists use FM synthesis. And for example, recording artists like Madonna and Phil Collins are particularly fans of FM synthesis. So this innovation turned out to be extraordinarily important innovation. John had this innovation. He then joined the Stanford faculty after he got his PhD. Consistent with a second point about the Stanford, the way things operate at Stanford, is that there was an emphasis on starting his own research center. So Stanford is a very research center-centric university, and people start their own centers, and they're encouraged to make those centers multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. So he was encouraged to start a center, and he was encouraged to get people from other departments to be in his center. And in particular, he included a scientist from computer science, and it just so happened that he met that person because they both played in the Stanford Symphony Orchestra. And John was a percussionist, and this computer science person was a tuba player. And they happened to sit near each other in the Stanford Symphony and got together and started talking, and so they formed a collaboration that improved upon some of the inventions that John had. So those were two important features, the interdisciplinary and center-centric. The other important feature of the culture, maybe the fourth important feature, is that the center had no money. And as a Stanford faculty member, I can tell you, Stanford actually doesn't give you much money. Stanford makes you go out and find money. So I'm not sure that the rest of the faculty here want to hear that, but that's the way we operate. You don't get much money. Or you might get a little money to start, but you don't get much after that. And so you have to go look for it. And so he and some others went out looking for money. And they got money in two major sources. One of them was research money, And they got money from National Science Foundation, that's NSF, is National Science Foundation, so the major scientific grantor in the US, and also from the National Education Association. We got two pots of money that were focused on research and some of the things about computer synthesized music that they were able to make a case for scientific merit. But the other source of money was business money. And with the emerging Office of Technology Licensing, or OTL, John and his colleagues went out searching with different companies to find money and who might want to license their technology. So they patented their technology and then they went out looking for people who might want to license it. And they came up with an unlikely source, which was Yamaha. Yamaha is, you probably all know, Yamaha is a Japanese company. And at the time it was a Japanese company that was most well known in the US for their motorcycles. So most people didn't even know that Yamaha was also a major producer of musical instruments. But Yamaha, through the Office of Technology Licensing, the Music Center and Yamaha hooked up with each other, and Yamaha gained an exclusive technology license for the Stanford technology. Later on, the CCRMA, which was the center, then gained dollars from new sources like a strong industrial affiliates program, which means we have these industrial affiliates programs whereby businesses can join a center for a fee every year, and they have access to graduate students, they have access to what's going on in the technology, to faculty members, and so forth. They also developed informal ties with people in industry who were often graduates of the program, and also developed a trademark program, so they were trademarking the Stanford music synthesis. Perhaps particularly important, and let me into the story, and I think I'm going to follow up on this with a little bit more data, but John and others began a deep involvement with Yamaha. So Yamaha didn't just exclusively license their technology, they also got Stanford faculty and Stanford students working on the technology with them. So part of the deal was that they would engage in consulting contracts with Yamaha to help them develop the technology. An important feature of what was going on as well was the Office of Technology Licensing, that's OTL, was developing at the same time and was orchestrating royalty revenue policies and orchestrating arrangements between Stanford faculty members and faculty students with companies. And the policy at the time, it may have changed somewhat now, it's roughly this though, 10% of the revenue royalty goes to the office for their own administrative services, 30% of royalties goes to inventors, 30% to the department, and 30% to the school. And what these monies do is in turn fund PhD students and fund more research. So you start to see a virtuous cycle between getting money from industry, plowing that money back into research. And so if I can summarize, I think what the point of this story is to say that at least what we've done at Stanford, it may not be the only model or the model for you, but it's a model that's worked for us. It's a culture of balancing science and business. Because you can't really, if all you do is sell your science to business, you start not producing very good science. But at the same time, if you keep your science all to yourself, to some extent you miss some of the exciting and important problems, both scientifically as well as from a real world point of view. So this center, and many centers at Stanford, try to strike that balance between commerce and science. And one of the ways they do it is through sort of what I'm calling a virtuous cycle of developing science, engaging with industry with that science, using the money that you get from industry to plow back into science in the sense of funding PhD students and funding further faculty and PhD student research. So a cycle between science, industry, back to science, and a circle that's reinforcing. Other I think, at least important points at Stanford are that the importance of independent research, the importance of PhD students in particular being able to do what they want to do if they can find at least a little bit of faculty support for it. The emphasis on building your own center that's multidisciplinary, and then tight purse strings means there's not a lot of money. You have to go out and find it. And finally, maybe just as a historical note, why does this happen at Stanford? In part, I think it happens because Stanford is so far from the government, so far from Washington, D.C. We're a 5 to 6 hour plane flight to Washington, D.C. And while our counterparts at MIT or University of Pennsylvania or Columbia can go down to Washington, D.C. for on a day trip, it's a big deal for us to change 3 hours and fly six hours and change 3 hours. So I think Stanford has been we're less tied to the government, and because we were perhaps less tied to the government, we in some sense were forced to go to a different business model than let's say MIT has done. So that's a case of Stanford music. I'm going to just make one final set of comments about the university lens. And this is, there's been a lot of research in the States about the role of faculty members as founders or participants in new ventures. And the overwhelming evidence suggests that ventures that are founded in university science do much better when a faculty member is deeply involved. The more involved that faculty member, typically the more successful the commercialization of the technology. And there are two, I think, reasons for that. One of them is a selection effect, simply meaning that faculty spend more time on their best ideas. So if I have a really great idea and a not so great idea, I'm obviously, maybe I will license my not so great idea, but I will in fact get into the venture myself. It's my great idea. So it's partly a selection effect of faculty spending more time on what their best stuff is. The other effect, however, is what's known as a treatment effect, and that is that the value that faculty members bring, faculty members and students, bring to a venture. They bring, I think it doesn't say this on the slide, but they bring what's known as tacit knowledge, meaning they bring an understanding of what the technology is good at doing, where the failures are, what the pitfalls are, what the strengths are. They explain the technology, they understand the technology much more deeply than, and they can convey that knowledge much more effectively when they're deeply engaged in the startup. If they just meet briefly with the company that's licensing it, you probably don't get much out of it. But it's that intimate contact with the details of the technology that are hard to explain that becomes important. The other things that faculty contribute are faculty typically are talented, are extremely talented people. And so they bring their talent, and finally they often have social connections that are helpful to the venture as well. So it's that tacit knowledge, their talent, and their social connections that are part of why faculty members are so important. And the more they're involved, typically the more successful the startup. Another well-known empirical fact is that star scientists disproportionately increase venture performance. In other words, that set of scientists who are at the top of their professions, the top 5 to 10% of scientists, disproportionately add value. So while many people may be able to get patents for things, it's the very top people who have the very best inventions that are sort of 10x more successful than an ordinary faculty member. So there is a real value to the extremely talented scientists being involved. And star scientists are particularly influential when they're at a university that's distant from the major communities. So while in Santiago, for example, it's probably the case that many Catholic scientists could do well in venture performance. If you're talking about a more distant city, Antofagasta, am I saying that right? I'm not sure. But a more distant city, then being a star would be particularly important. Being a star, or if you're not, or if you're not from the leading department. So overall, what's the point? The point is that if universities want successful commercialization of university technology, they have to, I think, not just motivate faculty members to be engaged, but make it easy for them to engage. Whether that making it easy is in the sense of making it, if not a positive, a good thing to do for tenure. For example, at Stanford, while you certainly don't have to start a company to get tenure, it's viewed positively to have started a company before tenure. To give people financial incentives like the OTL office, which is getting roughly 30% of the royalties. To make it easy for people by introducing them to lawyers and other kinds of people who may be useful for the startup. So overall, the point is to either motivate or at least to get rid of the barriers to faculty involvement in startups. That was the university lens. Let me now move to a more of a venture lens. How's my time good? Yeah. Is it okay? Let me start out by comparing universities and businesses. Universities and businesses are two very different social institutions that have different norms, different things go on. In universities, there is usually an open knowledge. Usually we share our discoveries, we publish our discoveries, we go to conferences, we let people know what we're doing. By contrast, industry is much more secretive. Industry is about competitive advantage. Industry is interested in keeping the good stuff away from people seeing it. Second distinction is, and maybe it's because I'm a university person too, but I think university people typically are extremes in terms of talent. At least in terms of the subject that they know. They may know nothing about anything else, but on the subject for which they're a professor, they are usually extraordinarily talented, and perhaps more talented than the average scientist in industry. Or at least that's true in the States. I'm not sure that's true in Chile, but it's true in the States that if you're talking about the specific scientific discipline, the extreme high talent people typically are more likely to be in universities than they are to be in companies. Another norm in universities is criticism of each other's work. I know I went one time to the University of Chicago, and I started my talk, and they were already criticizing my title. So the point is that universities engage in a lot of criticism. Or how many times have you written a paper and you've asked your colleagues for critique, and they'll say, "Oh, Cristobal, I loved your paper," and then give you like 20 pages of why they didn't like it. So I think we're all familiar with that part of universities, and we all criticize each other, and then we all go out and have a good time together because you don't let that bother you, and that's the way the world works. By contrast, it's a bit different in industry often, at least it is in the States. You can certainly criticize people, but you've also got to say a lot of nice things too. So it's a different norm about critique, which in turn I think makes for greater science. The ability, having to defend your ideas and being criticized, pretty much people looking for ways they can pick on you, is I think a real plus for gaining research. The final point I have up there, and there's some other points I could have, but in academics, for many people, the reward is fame. Whereas in business, it tends to be more about money. And to give you a story, when I first joined the Stanford faculty, my dean came and I was talking with him, and he ended the conversation with, "And Kathy, you know your job is to be famous." And so that was very clear, your job, be famous. I don't think that ever happens in business, that someone says, "And your job in this corporation is to be famous." They always say, "No, your job in this corporation is to make money." And so they're really two different, I think, incentive structures. And overall, the point I want to make in this next little part of the talk is that these two different institutional logics influence how science unfolds. And I'm going to start by talking about another case. This is the case of A123. It's actually an MIT spinoff. And there was a faculty member at MIT, Ming-Yet Chang, who was a member of the material science department. And he was working on technology breakthroughs in self-organizing materials. It's a form of nanotechnology. And he had some interesting insights and some preliminary breakthroughs that suggested the relevance of self-organizing for new batteries, battery technology. And I'm sure most of you know that battery technology is central to a number of the green technologies, particularly the green energy technology. So battery technology is an extraordinarily important technology going forward in green technology, and has been, for this maybe a less well-known observation, but battery technology has been relatively stagnant for probably 30 years. So to have a breakthrough in batteries is a big deal. So what this professor did was he had his breakthrough. He then met up with a serial entrepreneur who happened to be around MIT and knew what he was doing. And they started a company. And they raised money from some venture capitalists and from corporations like Motorola. And so far this story is, at least in the States anyway, is not all that unusual. The fact that professor has interesting idea, hooks up with a business person, they form a venture. That's not so unusual. But what happens in the next part of the story is that in the lab they have a serendipitous discovery of a slightly different new material that can improve the performance of current batteries, current lithium-ion batteries. And so what happens when they get this sort of serendipitous, unexpected discovery is that they're now faced with a dilemma. Does the company pursue the original technology, which is a massive technical breakthrough if it works, and perhaps then license this side discovery, license it and get money from that license to fund the bigger project? Or do they forget the big vision, the big technical breakthrough, and go for the somewhat smaller, more sure, more commercializable material? So do they go for the original big vision, or do they go for the smaller breakthrough? And if they do the smaller breakthrough, if they pursue the discovery, do they become just a supplier of that material or a component, or do they actually go into the much riskier business of creating a full battery and then competing with major Japanese and Chinese companies in batteries? So there's a set of decisions here. The big technology versus the smaller technology. If you do the smaller technology, is it just a component, or do you become a battery supplier? That's the they're faced. And so what do they do? Give you a minute to think about that. What do they do? What they do is they choose the low technical risk. They choose the option that was the serendipitous breakthrough that is useful in the current technology. But at the same time, they take the very highest business risk, which is vertical integration into batteries. So what this company, the board of directors of this company chooses to do is the easy technology route with the hard business route. And then that cascaded into a series of choices about who our partners should be. And so they had some commercial partners who were primarily customers. So their first partnership was with a company called Black & Decker, which does power tools for the construction industry. So they had battery-operated construction tools, as opposed to their potential rivals. So while they could have partnered with Japanese and Chinese battery suppliers, in fact, they partnered with their customers. Contrast that with, by the way, the music department story of Yamaha. That was largely partnering with your rival. This is partnering with your customers. And then they had to make some big decisions about where they were going to locate their manufacturing facility. And they chose to do some of it in the US, but they also make batteries in China. And then they were faced with the issue of how do you protect your intellectual property with China, because manufacturing in China, not only is vertical integration a big business risk, manufacturing in China is a big business risk. And so they went into China, and they did do that. They went to China, and then what they did was split up the manufacturing into a lot of different places, so no one part of China actually saw the whole battery. Is what they ended up doing. But the point of the story is that businesses gravitate towards and are interested in lower risk technologies with higher business risk. So in the case of A123, we see a choice to go towards low technical risk, high business risk. By contrast, the original technology is perhaps better developed in the university. It's too risky for business to take at the point at which they try to go commercial with it. So universities fit well when the technical risk is big, when it's more about basic science, but when it becomes more commercializable, it will then flow more into a business setting. So given the venture setting, the A123 executives pursue low technology risk, so the business logic of commercialization, and shelve their potentially breakthrough technology as self-organizing. And it's not until several years after do they ever come back to that original technology in the use of the university logic of science. Okay? So that's, in some sense, the irony of the story is that the really breakout technology does get shelved, at least for a while. Okay, the second case I want to just talk a bit about is this is a study that we've done at Stanford. One of our PhD students did this study. And it's a study of about 200 minimally invasive surgical device companies in the US. Minimally invasive surgical devices are those devices that, that when you have an operation, there's only a very small hole, not a big incision. It's very small. And what the research question in this study was, how do institutional differences in the source of funding of a venture influence the technology trajectory? So if we're looking at a set of ventures, how does where you get your money matter? There we are. I realized I skipped a slide there. Still look at that. And what this student did in this study was looked at several sources of funds: corporations, venture capital, National Science Foundation, actually National Institute of Health as well, so the big government science funding agencies. And SBIR is the Small Business Administration of the government. So the latter two, NSF and SBIR, are government. The first is science, the second is business. And it turns out that this setting of surgical devices is a particularly good setting for looking at this research question, because there are multiple funding sources. All of these funding sources are very active in this sector. And also it's an interesting setting because you can separate out the technical success from the commercial success. You can measure the technical success through patenting, and that's not always the case. Other industries, for example, software patenting is not a very good measure of what you're doing. But in surgical devices, patenting is a good measure of technical success. You can also measure commercial success because you can measure whether or not the device was approved by the regulatory agencies. And if the device is approved by the regulatory agencies, you have to show that the device works and is substantially better than anything else on the market. So you have to have a product that works that's better than anything else. So it gives you a nice measure of commercial success. And so the question was, how does each of these institutions affect the technical and the commercial success of the technology? I'm going to let you think about that for a minute, see what you think happens. This is the basic result. The basic result is if you get money from corporations or from the National Science Foundation or the National Institute of Health, you will see ventures typically engaging in greater technical success. By the way, I won't explain what we did statistically, but essentially we did what's known as a diffs and diffs statistical test, which controls for the fact that certain companies may be predisposed to one or the others of these choices. What we found, or what the student found, was that corporations are actually interested in patenting and technical success. Most corporations invest in startups because they're interested in the technology. And so, in some sense, unsurprisingly, corporations increase the amount of technical success. Although you do have to, whenever you're dealing with corporations, worry about the intellectual property protection. And while you can patent things, other things may be better with a trade secret. Similarly, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health also increased technical success. By contrast, the venture capitalists, if you had a significant amount of venture capital, these businesses tended to have more commercial success, so more products. So corporations fund for science, venture capitalists fund for products, and finally the government agency that's focused on business success, in fact, didn't really affect companies one way or another. That was just sort of a waste of taxpayer dollars. That's the study of surgical devices. And the implication is that institutional differences in the funding sources influence the technology trajectories. Corporations and scientific governments and scientific government agencies push the science agenda of the university institutional logic. VCs push the commercial agenda of the business institutional logic. And the final example I just want to mention was an example that was a study of the biotech industry. As you may know, the biotechnology industry is an important industry in San Francisco, Boston, and San Diego. This is a Boston area study. And it was a longitudinal study looking at the network connections among players in biotech, universities, hospitals, venture capital, corporations, and new ventures. And the authors of this study were developing network diagrams of the relationships among all these actors. In the early days of biotechnology, the universities were the central actors in the network. The networks were largely organized around MIT and Harvard in the Boston area. And everyone was connected with everyone. So companies, universities, and so on were all connected to each other with these two hubs of Harvard and MIT. However, and that was the science phase of biotech. When it became more of the commercial phase, that network shifted over time. And it became a much more fragmented network around dyadic relationships, primarily between pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies, with a little bit with the universities. So what happened over time was it went from a very open, fluid network organized around universities to a more closed, dyadic set of relationships between essentially business interests. So a shift from a university logic to, as the technology has matured, to more of a commercial business logic. So overall, I think I'm now kind of at the end. So let me just say what the end is. From the university lens, the idea is that the government has been very important, at least in the US, and university culture that balances science and business has been very helpful with regard to commercializing university technology. The notion that faculty involvement is extremely important for making success, commercial success. If faculty are not involved, that either suggests that they don't think it's a very good invention, or they're being incentivized for doing other things. From the venture lens perspective, the trajectory of science depends a lot on the institution in which the science is embedded. And the degree to which it's embedded in a commercial setting, you will probably sacrifice some of the technology, some of the scientific elegance of what you're trying to do. Because ventures tend to excel with less ambitious science and more ambitious business. That said, there is a place for commercialization, there's a place for pure science. Pure science is more of a university task, at least in the US, whereas the somewhat less cutting-edge science has a place in the commercial realm. So with that, that's I think what I want to say today. Muchas gracias.